Hey guys, Rivalry here, and today I wanted to talk to you about the time that McLaren dominated the Can-Am series using Chevrolet V8 engines. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Many of you might not know what the Can-Am series actually is. It is a series that basically ran from 1966 to 1987. And it featured very little restrictions in comparison to any other racing series, even by today's standards, because there's a lot today. Now, what this meant you could have as light a car as you want, as much horsepower as you wanted, and it did not have a displacement restriction. So this meant huge innovation in between this time period, where basically auto manufacturers could throw down whatever they could make and go compete on the track. It wasn't restricted. Now the story of the McLaren Can-Am series cars actually starts a couple years before the Can-Am series itself. In 1964, McLaren introduced the McLaren M8A, as seen here. Now the McLaren M8A was raced in different Group 7 series of racing events across Europe and North America. It featured a 4.5-liter Oldsmobile V8 that made 310 horsepower. The M8A only weighed 1,299 pounds. While the M8A did produce good horsepower at 310 horsepower and only weighing 1,299 pounds, it just was not enough. They actually scrapped the 4.5-liter Oldsmobile all-aluminum V8 in place of a small block Chevy 327. Now this was bored out to a 333, and this was put into what they would call the M1B McLaren. Now what the small block Chevy 327 did for the McLaren M1B was it gave it a little bit more power as well as more reliability. So instead of the 310 horsepower made by the Oldsmobile V8, it did make 340 horsepower, transferring over to the small block 327. But since the Oldsmobile V8 was an all-aluminum engine, it did gain about 56 pounds in that process going over to the small block Chevy. And the M1B was actually the car that McLaren brought to the 1966 Can-Am series. However, they did not get a victory that year. That was given to the Lola T70, which placed first. However, they did get a podium finish, and Bruce McLaren actually placed third, and Chris Amon, another driver for McLaren, placed in sixth. The good news on this, though, is that McLaren did not back down. With the introduction of the 350 in 1967, they re-entered with a newly designed M6A, as seen here. And to prepare for the 1967 Can-Am series, McLaren stepped up and essentially managed to put this build of the M6A from paper to a full-blown car in 11 weeks. So they had a car built in 11 weeks and managed to put 2,000 miles on that car in preparation for the Can-Am series to show up prepared to win rather than to even take any chances. The McLaren M6A was the first car that really put them on the roadmap, and a lot of people regard it as, well, the first McLaren. Making 525 horsepower out of a small block Chevy 350 back in the 1960s was absolutely insane. It's not like today where you can just bolt in, a nice set of heads, a roller camshaft, a good intake, set of headers, good to go, you're making 525 horsepower. That's easy now, but back then it was not, because they were restricted on, for example, head flow. They only had flat tappet camshafts. A lot of things that you couldn't get back then to really make that amount of power easily. So it was really just left up to high compression, and that's what you'll find in a lot of these older engines is they ran really high compression. Unfortunately, there's no information on what compression ratio that the M6A's engine actually had, but my guess is it's well over 14-1, which by today's standards is only going to allow you to run race gas. And with the M6A, McLaren managed to pull off a first and second place finish on the 1967 Can-Am Series by Bruce McLaren in first place and Denny Hulme in second place. The Lola T70 was now in the rearview mirror. So, while we're at it, why don't we listen to the sound of a beautiful McLaren M6A. And for the 1968 Can-Am Series, McLaren stepped up again because, well, 1968 became the introduction for the Chevrolet ZL1 engine. My absolute favorite all-time production engine from Chevrolet is the aluminum headed and aluminum block 427 big block Chevy from Chevrolet. So they ended up shoving one of these into a new car called the McLaren M8A. And while it did pick up a few pounds, rather than being 1,356 pounds, instead now it was 1,451. Well, they also added another 100 horsepower, so they managed 625 horsepower out of the ZL1 engine on their new McLaren M8A. And this once again blew away the competition. And even the crazy ZL1 engine that they put in the M8A did have to be overhauled a little bit because, as I said, they went for more power. It's an unlimited class. It is pretty much unrestricted on what you could do to your engine. So originally the ZL1 engine made right around 550, 560 horsepower all said and done. I know it was technically rated at 430. That was a lie. That basically Chevrolet did in the 60s for insurance purposes, but the engine actually made around 550, 560 horsepower. So McLaren did have to push the envelope a little bit on that to get their desired number of, well, what they ended up with, 625 horsepower. This was done through a higher compression ratio. The ZL1 actually had a 12-to-1 compression, while the Can-Am Series 1 was around 14-to-1. And so for the 1968 Can-Am Series, once again, Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme both placed first and second. This was also the first year that Can-Am saw that most contenders were actually using McLaren's cars to compete in races, obviously with different setups, and actually, well, different models of cars, because McLaren kept the M8A for themselves, realistically, to compete in the Can-Am Series, but there were 9 overall contenders, including McLaren themselves, that were using McLaren's cars to compete in these races. So while McLaren was taking first and second, they were also making money off of the fact that the other contenders were buying their cars. So I know you all want to hear it, and I do too, so let's jump right to watching one of these M8As go around the track with the beautiful ZL1 engine. So for the 1969 series, pretty much they realized that they had gotten quite a few things right in the 1968 series. So there were not too many different changes here. They had a wing on their car that was mounted a little bit higher than previously before. The wheels were now 1 inch wider, that way they could fit a little bit wider of a tire on there for grip. And on the engine side, they actually did bump it from a 427 to a 430 cubic inch and 625 horsepower to 630. So not a huge difference, but what they did do for this engine is instead of the traditional combo that they used for the 427, instead now it was a shorter stroke version of the engine with a larger bore. This helped with piston speed, keeping piston speed down for reduced wear and basically just higher reliability when they're pushing that 7,000 RPM limit pretty much all the time when they're racing around that track. And so this was another iteration of the M8 class car, so it was M8B instead of M8A, which was used in the year prior. So for the 1969 series, it was once again a Bruce and Denny show where they took first and second place. In 1969, McLaren actually secured a deal with Reynolds Aluminum to create new silicone aluminum blocks for their new McLaren, the M8D. Slightly different, however, they managed to put a 7.6 liter, aka 463 cubic engine in their M8D instead of the original 427 or 430 as seen in previous years. They were initially offered an 8-liter version, however, instead of going with that 488 cubic inch engine, they turned that down basically to keep things more reliable and went with a 463 cubic inch engine, the 7.6 liter, still an all aluminum big block Chevy. This engine now produced a whopping 670 horsepower. So in the span of only 4 years, they managed to go from 340 horsepower to 670 horsepower competing in this Can-Am series. Things were getting crazy. So the 1970 series actually does take a little bit of a turn of events. Now, they had been working on the M8D, so this was a different iteration as the wing that they previously had used in 1969 was no longer allowed in the Can-Am series, so they had to do basically a set of fins with a wing along the top of it that wasn't too far above the bodywork of the car. Unfortunately, while during test driving this car, Bruce McLaren actually died. He was going down a straight stretch, essentially testing the car, doing about 170 miles an hour, when part of the bodywork from the car had actually come loose, caused the car to go into a spin, and eventually crash into a wall, which had killed him instantly. Even with the death of Bruce McLaren in 1970, Denny Hulme still placed first in the Can-Am series overall, taking home that championship title. And to even top it off, unfortunately they didn't get second place with their other driver, but they did fill Bruce's spot a little bit and did have another driver, and they were able to place third. So overall, once again, McLaren did win the 1970 Can-Am series. So for the 1971 season, even with the death of Bruce McLaren on their back, they still managed to do extraordinarily well. This year they brought the M8F instead of the M8D, so pretty much every year they've had some sort of revision, and this was nothing short of one of their previous revisions. Now the body style was pretty much the same. They added basically aerodynamic lips on both sides that ran down the entire length of the vehicle on either side. Other than that, really not too much of a difference between the M8D and the previous year that Bruce McLaren was driving and passed away in. But with the M8F, they actually stepped it up once again. Now the engine was 494 cubic inches instead of 464. Instead of 680 horsepower, now it was making 740 horsepower. So things were ramping up very quickly in the horsepower department for the Can-Am series overall. And basically nothing short of a win. We have Denny Hulme and Peter Revson now. Peter Revson actually placed first, and Denny Hulme placed second for the 1971 season. So once again, McLaren managed a first and second place Can-Am win. Now, while we're at it, why don't we go ahead and listen to the sound of that beautiful M8F McLaren. So unfortunately, 1971 would actually be the last year that McLaren would win the Can-Am series. So they managed to make it happen from 1967 all the way to 1971, placing first place in every single year. However, 1972 was a bit different. They went prepared, and unfortunately they still lost to the Penske racing team, which was partnered with Porsche, using the Porsche 917, which was a twin turbocharged 900 horsepower car that came in very light as well. So 1972, McLaren brought the McLaren M20 because they knew that Porsche was bringing, or Penske / Porsche was bringing the 917 that year. They did bring the McLaren M20, which was now a 509 cubic inch big block Chevy, a lighter chassis, and on top of it all made 787 horsepower. But unfortunately that was just not up to snuff when it came to Porsche's 917 with 900 brake horsepower. So even though they came somewhat prepared, Porsche and Penske had 4 times the amount of budget that McLaren had for 1972, so Porsche kind of showed up and shut them down. Regardless though, Porsche They placed first and third place. However, Denny Holm in the McLaren M20 managed to slip in second place. So it wasn't a total loss. Even down quite a bit of horsepower, they still managed to pull second place, which was pretty impressive considering that they at least beat one of the Porsche 917s with less than, well, a quarter of the budget. So while we're here, why don't we listen to the final car on this list, the McLaren M20. Let's listen to a startup video. Unfortunately, 1972 was the final year that McLaren actually competed in the Can-Am series. With Porsche stepping in with 4 times the budget with the Penske team, McLaren just honestly could not compete. They had 4 times the money, and well, they basically folded their cards and decided, hey, we're going to transfer all of our time and motivation into Formula One racing. While nothing to be said, it's a little sad that they left the Can-Am series. However, they did manage to give us 5 years, 1967 to 1971, of first place finishes using basically their technology mixed with the heart of a muscle car. And I think that's honestly awesome to actually go over that, because there's no videos really covering the Can-Am series when it came to McLaren, but they dominated the series for 5 years. And I wanted to get that information out there because, well, I thought it was very intriguing that they're using big and small block Chevys in a McLaren. You wouldn't think about a McLaren with a muscle car engine today. And so I think it's crazy to look back on, and I just wanted to share that information with you guys. So if you guys liked the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, you guys have a great day.